Have you ever heard this saying? Bad people are simply good people who once got hurt. It sounds simple, but it is often born from wounds that run very deep. Many of us once knew someone who used to be kind, but slowly turned cold and hardened. And the most uncomfortable question is this: what if that person is actually us? Many people don't change because they want to become bad. They change because their kindness kept getting repaid with mistreatment. They weren't just unappreciated. They were underestimated, belittled, bullied, until their self-worth slowly crumbled. At that point, many people begin to draw a painful conclusion. If I keep being kind, I will keep getting hurt. In psychology, this is not about morality, but about survival. But if more and more good people choose to harden themselves, will kindness eventually disappear from this world? Or does kindness still exist, just hiding now, because it has been hurt too many times?
So, is it true that people who do evil were once good people who got hurt? The answer is both yes and no. In psychology, many destructive behaviors begin with pain. Pain from unfair treatment, from rejection, from being belittled or betrayed, from bullying, from a simple human need to be seen and valued going unmet. When this pain isn't faced or healed, the mind finds a way to survive. Defense mechanisms kick in. Perspectives shift. How they see the world, how they see others, even who they are, starts to change. The world begins to feel unsafe. If I stay good, I'll be trampled. I must be tough before anyone can hurt me. Psychologists call this hostile attribution bias, the tendency to assume that others always have bad intentions. And when you live like that, it's easy to respond with coldness, aggression, or manipulation. In these cases, being evil isn't about wanting to be bad. It's about surviving, protecting yourself from further pain. But not every person who does harm comes from hurt. Some simply choose cruelty. So, the next time you meet someone who seems harsh, remember this. Sometimes behind the hardness is a heart that was once soft. Before someone becomes hardened, before their empathy begins to fade, and before they do things they once believed were wrong, there's a phase that is almost always overlooked. A phase where someone is hurt, yet the pain is not considered important enough.
Not even by themselves. Psychological wounds rarely arrivent rudely. They are not always acts of extreme violence or dramatic, traumatic events. More often, they grow from things that seem small, but happen repeatedly, and precisely because they appear insignificant, they go unnoticed for far too long. Every wound has an origin. It rarely begins with something dramatic. No loud impact, no single moment of collapse. Most wounds are born quietly, from things dismissed as small, repeated often enough to reshape the mind. This is where pain truly begins. 1. When the world feels unfair. Many people grow up with a simple belief: if I am kind, the world will be kind to me. This belief is not naive. It is a healthy moral foundation. But problems begin when reality repeatedly contradicts it. There are those who are honest, yet pushed aside. Those who work hard, yet are ignored. Those who are sincere, yet taken advantage of. Meanwhile, those who are cunning, skilled at manipulation, seem to move further ahead. At first, a person can still tolerate it. They tell themselves, it's okay, maybe it's just not my time yet. But when this injustice becomes a pattern, no longer a coincidence, a deep exhaustion begins to emerge. Not anger, not revenge, but kind of weariness from having to remain good in a world that offers no equal return. An exhaustion that is suppressed for too long rarely ends in wisdom. It often turns into cynicism. 2. The wound of silent neglect. There are wounds that do not bleed. They are invisible, yet they slowly erode from within. Neglect. Not being greeted, not being asked, not being included, not because one is hated, but because one is considered insignificant. For some people, neglect feels more painful than open conflict, because conflict at the very least acknowledges one's existence. Neglect does not. Slowly, the mind begins to absorb a dangerous message. My presence does not matter. No matter what I do, it will go unnoticed. And when this feeling lingers for too long, a person begins to question their own worth. At this point, the wound has not yet turned into anger. It still exists as emptiness. But emptiness that is left unattended often seeks another form, just to feel alive again. 3. The wound of humiliation and shame. There are wounds that emerge, not because someone is physically harmed, but because their dignity is dismantled. Being belittled, compared to others, turn into a joke, especially when it comes from those who were meant to provide safety. Shame that is continuously suppressed does not disappear on its own. It does not evaporate. It transforms into defensiveness, into coldness, into the desire one day to prove that the world misjudged them. And ironically, in the process of proving themselves, many people begin to abandon the values they once held. Not because they want to become cruel, but because they're tired of feeling small. 4. The wound of betrayal. Yet there is one wound that most quickly alters how a person sees the world. Betrayal. Not because its impact is always the greatest, but because it shatters the foundation of trust. When someone is hurt by a person they trusted, what breaks is not only the relationship, but the sense of safety toward other human beings. From that point on, closeness feels suspicious. Kindness feels risky, and without realizing it, a person begins to build distance, even before the next wound has a chance to occur. Not because they want to hurt others, but because they do not want to be hurt again. These wounds do not immediately create evil people. They create people who are cautious, who are tired, who have lost trust in the world and in other people. This is where change begins to work, slowly, almost imperceptibly. And the question is no longer where the wound came from, but rather what a person chooses to do with that wound. Because from this point, two different paths open, and not everyone chooses the same one. Wounds do not always turn someone into a bad person, but wounds that go unnoticed, unacknowledged, and unprocessed slowly begin to dictate how a person lives. At first, this change almost always feels reasonable, even logical. A person begins to tell themselves, I'm just being more careful now. And that is true. They're not becoming worse. They're trying to survive. 1. From caution to suspicion. After being hurt, people learn one important thing, that the world is not always safe. The problem is, this lesson is often overgeneralized. One betrayal, turns into the belief that everyone is capable of betrayal. One experience of being belittled turns into the assumption that others are always trying to bring us down. This is the point where caution slowly shifts into suspicion, not because of hatred, but because of the fear of reliving the same pain. And fear that goes unrecognized often disguises itself as logic. 2. Hostile attribution bias. When the world feels hostile, in psychology, this pattern is known as hostile attribution bias. It is the tendency to interpret other people's actions as threats or malicious intent, even when the situation is ambiguous. A wounded person rarely thinks, maybe they didn't mean it. What arises instead is, they must have an agenda. To outsiders, this pattern may seem excessive, but to someone who has been hurt, it feels like self-protection, because in their experience, ignoring warning signs once led to very real pain. The problem is, when the world is constantly interpreted as hostile, the responses that emerge are no longer neutral. The tone of voice becomes cold. The attitude becomes defensive. Empathy is narrowed, not because empathy disappears, but because it is seen as a risk. 3. When survival mechanisms become identity. At this stage, defense mechanisms are no longer temporary. They begin to settle in. A person no longer says, "I'm just being cautious." They begin to say, "This is who I am." This is where wounds stop being experiences and start becoming identities. Harshness is seen as strength. Coldness is seen as maturity. Indifference is seen as wisdom, when in reality, it is often just another form of emotional exhaustion. But because this pattern feels protective, it is maintained, and the longer it is maintained, the harder it becomes to distinguish between the authentic self and the self shaped by wounds. 4. When self-protection starts to harm others. At this point, many people are unaware that they have begun to hurt others in the very ways they once deeply resented. Withdrawing, manipulating situations to remain on top, controlling before being controlled, not out of a desire for power, but out of fear of losing control. Yet the outcome is often the same. Others get hurt, relationships fracture, trust becomes even harder to grow. And ironically, each new conflict only reinforces the old belief. See, the world really is not safe. And so the cycle repeats. 5. Evil as a strategy, not an intention. This is where it becomes important to understand. In many cases, evil is not the original intention. It is a survival strategy that has been taken too far, an attempt at self-protection that has lost its direction. A person does not wake up in the morning with the intention of becoming bad. They simply say, "I don't want to get hurt again." But when this survival strategy is never examined, it begins to erode one's humanity itself. And at a certain point, a person no longer knows how to be gentle again without feeling foolish or weak. But one thing is important to note. Not everyone stops here. Some become aware of their patterns. Some find the courage to face their wounds. And some choose a different path. But there are also those who go further, not merely surviving, but consciously choosing cruelty. And that is where we must draw a distinction between those who are wounded and those who deliberately choose to no longer care. 1. When empathy doesn't die, but is silenced. Many people assume that cruel individuals lack empathy, when in reality, empathy is often still there, is simply suppressed by choice. Because empathy is seen as inconvenient, weakening, an obstacle to one's goals. In this process, conscience does not disappear suddenly. It is pushed aside, silenced, conditioned to go unheard. And like a muscle that is rarely used, it gradually weakens. 2. Rationalization, the quietest way to be cruel. Those who consciously choose cruelty rarely see themselves as cruel. They have reasons. The world is cruel anyway. If I'm not like this, I'll lose. They deserve it. These rationalizations work subtly. They soothe the mind. They wrap cruelty in logic that sounds reasonable. And when cruelty feels logical, it no longer feels wrong. 3. Power and the quiet pleasure. At a certain point, cruelty is no longer committed for survival. Pause. It is done because it provides a sense of control. Controlling others, controlling situations, controlling outcomes. For some people, this control delivers a sensation they never obtained through healthier means. And that sensation can feel calming, not in the form of joy, but in a cold stillness. I am above. I am safe. I cannot be touched. For when moral boundaries no longer matter, at this stage, the line between right and wrong does not truly disappear. It simply no longer feels important. Moral values become flexible, adjusted to fit necessity. What is wrong today can be justified tomorrow, not because of confusion, but because of choice. And here lies the clearest distinction between those who are wounded and those who choose cruelty. The former still wrestle with guilt. The latter have made peace with indifference. 5. Why they are hard to change. Many people ask, why are people like this so hard to change? Because change demands one thing. They refuse to give honesty with themselves. To admit that they chose this path means having to face the guilt they have long suppressed. And for some people, that feels more frightening than continuing to live without empathy. So they go on with their lives, functional, productive, yet disconnected from emotional depth. Understanding this does not mean justifying it. Empathy is not the same as tolerating cruelty. There are wounds that need to be held with care, but there are also boundaries that must be upheld, because if we fail to distinguish between those who are still struggling with their wounds and those who deliberately silence their conscience, we risk sacrificing ourselves in the name of misplaced understanding. And perhaps true maturity is not only about understanding why someone became who they are today, but also about knowing when to stop giving space. If we draw a single thread from this entire discussion, we arrive at a quiet conclusion that wounds explain many things, but they do not justify everything. Yes, many people cause harm because they themselves were once hurt, and understanding that makes us more human. But understanding without boundaries can slowly turn into permissiveness. Every human being carries wounds. No one grows up completely intact. Yet not everyone uses their wounds in the same way. Some choose to confront them. Some choose to heal. Some choose to stop halfway. And there are those who use their wounds as a reason to hurt others in return. This is where the crucial point lies, not in what we experience, but in what we choose afterward. Perhaps while watching this video, someone came to mind, someone who is harsh, cold, difficult to approach. Or perhaps you thought yourself. And if that is the case, this question is worth asking, not to judge, but to be honest. Is that harshness still protecting you, or has it begun to confine you? Is that vigilance still maintaining healthy boundaries, or has it turned into a wall that no longer lets anyone in? Empathy never asks us to sacrifice ourselves, and firmness is not a sign of lacking empathy. True maturity emerges when we are able to do both, to understand another person's wounds without normalizing their cruelty, because if every wound is always justified, then cruelty will never truly end. It will only change hands. Perhaps what is most frightening is not the cruel people out there, but the possibility that without realizing it, we ourselves slowly become the very person we once feared. And that awareness, however uncomfortable it may be, is the beginning of a new choice. The choice to stop, the choice to reflect, the choice not to pass our wounds on to the next person. Because in the end, the world does not change when good people are wounded and then choose to become cruel. The world changes when a wounded person decides not to continue the cycle.